I probably shouldn't read all of these with in a house of worship, but they come out right with what it is. It puts the gold star on the chest, or it gets the hose again. This is one of my friends, Daryl Lampshade, a charming name. Quick question, why have the Jews been kicked out of so many countries if they never did anything wrong? Please answer. This is a common theme in the alt-right. They like to make Jews answer to our own oppression. I will just point out that Ari Goldberg is almost certainly not this man's real name. And he uses this is an alt-right cartoon character of the sniveling Jew. He actually has a name. There's a whole, in my book, I explain the whole origin of that cartoon character. And he shows up again and again in alt-right motifs. And this is another one that I just bring out because it is another example of how they make you answer to your own oppression. Haven't Jews been kicked out from all nations? It will be your turn soon. This is another one. They actually, the thing is that they love to get a rise from the people that they're targeting, so they think it's very funny that there's no business like show of business. I'll just let that one speak for itself. Goebbels. It's kind of funny because the Nazis lost World War II, but they find real heroism in Joseph Goebbels and all things Third Reich. So this is a concept that the Jews run everything in secret, and if the goyim, if the non-Jews could just discover the secret to how the Jews run everything, then we'll have to shut it down. And this is a thing that you hear all the time in the alt-right. The goyim knows, shut it down. And as I said, the alt-right would like us to leave, and they have a place for us to go, Israel, and that's they had empowered Donald Trump to send us away. So that is, I just wanted to show you a few things. We don't need these anymore. And, you know, people often ask me if I was scared during all of this. Did I fear for my life? Did I worry about my children? And perhaps I was foolish, but I didn't. I wasn't really scared. I just wasn't going to be threatened by these 2-bit cyber terrorist Nazis. But, you know, I am scared now. Because since I began writing this book about my own experiences, a follower of what he called the alt-Reich came upon a young black student at just outside the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. He demanded that the student step aside on the sidewalk. The student did not step aside. The student was stabbed to death. In Portland, Oregon, 2 men had come to the rescue of a young teenage girl wearing a hijab on the light rail in Portland. They were stabbed to death. Then, of course, came Charlottesville. And the world saw the alt-right jump from the internet to the flesh with their chants of Jews will not replace us, their tiki torches, their melees, and ultimately the death of a counter-protester, Heather Heyer, run down by a bigot in a Dodge Charger. So yes, I am scared. Israel was born of one of the worst atrocities in human history, certainly the worst atrocity in Jewish history, the Holocaust. Its existence is a testament to the desire to keep Jews safe. But let me tell you, if the United States is a hostile country to the Jew, Israel is not safe. It is by far the largest recipient of American military aid. Israel's Iron Dome missile shield was built with Israeli ingenuity, but also a lot of American help. Israeli engineers actually helped design the Joint Strike Fighter, and Israel's Air Force will be the only one in the Middle East that gets the plane. But when it rolls off that assembly line, it will be rolling off in Fort Worth, Texas, not in Tel Aviv. The fact is that the Jewish haven is only safe as long as it's under the American security umbrella. American Jewry should be at least as focused on keeping the United States safe for Jews as it is for sustaining Israel's security. Back in 2014, before really anyone had heard of the alt-right, the vicious lads in their parents' basements who played video games and were hanging out on these kind of fever swamps of places like 4chan and 8chan and Reddit. These are online chat groups that you probably don't even know exist. They collectively decided that a small group of women video game writers had to be destroyed. Their offense was that they were writing video games for women. They had video games like for depression. They had a video game that didn't, run prostitutes over for points or shoot down basically anybody. So they attacked, and they used all these tricks that the alt-right would eventually adopt. They doxed. That means they published personal information, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers online, so anybody could go attack these women in person or attack their bank accounts or steal their identities. They also did this thing called swatting, which is where they would call the local police station near the women's houses and say, hey, I see there's a man with a gun in this house, and send the SWAT team over to raid. It's a terrible thing. Even if the people are okay, often dogs get shot. In the case of Zoe Quinn, a bitter ex-boyfriend had joined this whole thing, and he compiled a mix of innuendo, sexually explicit kiss-and-tell stories, exaggerations, and falsehoods into something he called the Zoe Post. And then he put it online on 4chan. And he knew the loudest denizens that were involved in what's called Gamergate would attack, and they did. The horrors that were visited on Zoe Quinn boggle the mind. Her Wikipedia site was altered to read, died October 14th, 2014. That happened to be the date of her next public appearance. Social media posts urged her to kill herself, pictured her covered in semen, and the threat, things like, if I ever see you are doing a panel at an event, I will literally kill you. Or, we have to rape Zoe Quinn and take everything from her. We have to ruin her life. Remember, all this woman did was design video games. So what happened to Zoe Quinn was horrific, but it was also important because at that point, most of the racists and the anti-Semites were living in their own little worlds. They had Stormfront and the Daily Stormer and these Klan websites, and they were just talking to each other. But when they saw what the misogynist lads could do to these women, they said, aha, it was like a signal flare. They realized, wow, we can do this too. We can spread our hate, but we need to leave our little cloistered world, and we need to go on to sites like 4chan and 8chan, even the discussion rooms of YouTube and eventually Twitter. And by doing that, they made sure that a whole new generation would just stumble into it. The shooter in the shooter in Parkland was kind of swimming in this cesspool. People are just running into it, and they're learning about these new ideologies out there because it's now much, much more easy to spread, much easier to get the word out. And I bring this also up for a more uplifting point. Zoe Quinn is an amazing woman. With her boyfriend, who happens to be a yeshiva guy named Alex Lifshitz, they started an outfit called Crash Override. It was a support service for victims of abuse online, for social workers, for lawyers, for cybersecurity experts. And the Crash Override website offers these practical tools on how to combat this kind of abuse. It wasn't particularly about anti-Semitism, it was just abuse, although anti-Semitism was always part of it. In its first year, Crash Override had a hotline. In 2015, Zoe Quinn personally handled more than 1,000 calls. She eventually had to shut it down because she personally couldn't do it all herself. It was just killing her. So what would it mean to Zoe, our countless victims out there, if Jewish wherewithal, if Jewish money and might and organizational skills were put behind something like Crash Override, if we actually did practical things to combat what's happening online? There's this guy, his name is PewDiePie. I won't spell you his name, PewDiePie, but he's like this YouTuber. He's from Sweden. My kids, my teenage girls used to love him. They've kind of outgrown him. But PewDiePie did this thing where he hired these guys from India, for $5 to do something, and he wouldn't say what it was. And then he said, we was to see if what the guys from India would do. And what he did was he was shocked because they actually did it. They unfurled a banner somewhere in India that said "Death to the Jews," and danced around with it. And everyone, like all these kids, saw this. And PewDiePie was like pretended to be aghast and embarrassed that this actually happened. But the fact that he even thought to do that, and the fact that kids, 11-year-old boys who love PewDiePie saw these Indian boys in a jungle dancing around with a sign that said "Death to the Jews," that's scary to me. In May of 2016, Donald Trump was marauding through the Republican primaries. Somehow, the Republican cognoscenti in Washington thought they were going to stop him from getting the Republican nomination through some undetermined deus ex machina that never manifested itself. At the time, Robert Kagan, a Brookings Institution scholar and a Republican of good standing, wrote a column called "This is How Fascism Comes to America." And as I did often, I took a snippet from it, I put it onto Twitter, and I sent it out into the world. I got an odd reply back from somebody who called himself Cyber Trump. It just said, "Hello, Weisman." That's it, except the Weisman was in 3 parentheses. I didn't know what it meant. I intuited that because Weisman was such a Jewish-sounding name, it had some kind of meaning. So I said, "Care to explain?" And he came back, "What ho, the vaunted Ashkenazi intelligence, ha, ha, ha. It's a dog whistle, fool. I have belled the cat for my fellow goyim." And then the onslaught began. And let me explain what belling the cat meant. I didn't know this at the time. I came to know it later. Unbeknownst to me, an enterprising member of the alt-right, their name, not mine, that strange agglomeration of racists, anti-Semites, white nationalists, and America Firsters, had created a piece of software called a Google plugin. You could get it on Google. It had the bland name of the coincidence indicator, so it wouldn't rise to Google's notice. But if you downloaded the coincidence indicator, you could search for Jews to go after. Google searches don't pick up punctuation marks. I don't know if you knew that. I didn't know that. But if you have the coincidence indicator, you could go for one particular set of punctuation marks with these 3 parentheses. They called them echoes, by the way. A leader of the alt-right named Andrew Anglin, who happens to be this very malicious editor of the Daily Stormer, a neo-Nazi site, had decided that he would slap these parentheses on Jewish targets, mostly Jewish journalists at the time, and then his minions could search and destroy.